Congratulations to one of my favorite players in the history of Major League Baseball. David Ortiz, Mr. Big Papi, is now a member of the Hall of Fame. He is a first ballot Hall of Famer, but whether you like it or not, the conversation was stolen and muddied by Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. Everyone and their mother was on Twitter and social media yesterday just throwing out opinions whether you think Barry Bonds should be in the Hall of Fame or not. So that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to go ahead and break down why the Hall of Fame doesn't make sense anymore. And a lot of people are just saying, hey, the Hall of Fame doesn't even really mean anything anymore because the voters have no idea what they're doing. It's subjectivity over objectivity. Everyone's opinion and personal bias is coming into play, and there's zero consistency. So let's go ahead and talk about it right now. So the Hall of Fame results, as you guys can see on the screen right now, David Ortiz is in. He had about 77% of the votes. You need 75 to get in. He was the only player inducted into the Hall of Fame. Up next, you had Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. So the two biggest reasons why everyone thinks Barry Bonds is not on the Hall of Fame, even though he never tested positive, but David Ortiz did test positive. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The first reason, David Ortiz was nicer. It's as simple as that. He was well liked by the media. So of course the media and writers, they turn into voters. So they're going to give him, David Ortiz, the benefit of the doubt over Barry Bonds, who, I've seen a few interviews. He wasn't the nicest guy. He was very condescending. So I think that came around to bite him in the you-know-what once it came time for him to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. For me, I think it's much more simple than that. Hank freaking Aaron. If Barry Bonds had retired at 680 home runs and not go ahead to surpass Babe Ruth and eventually the most hallowed record in sports, at least to me, the home run record set by Hank Aaron, the fact that he passed them, everyone kind of thought he didn't deserve that. There's an asterisk on the baseball in Cooperstown. I've seen it live in person. If you have not been to Cooperstown, please go, even though it might resemble more of a circus nowadays because of all of the madness that is surrounding just Cooperstown in general, with Barry Bonds not being inducted in, A-Rod getting about 35% of votes. We'll talk about him in just a second as well. But realistically, if Hank Aaron's record had never been broken, I think the conversation would have died a few years ago and Barry Bonds would have been in the Hall of Fame along with Roger Clemens. But that's just my opinion. And if you guys are wondering if I would have given Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens a vote, I would have, because Barry Bonds is arguably the best player of all time, and I think he's the best hitter of all time, and Roger Clemens won 7 Cy Youngs. Now, again, the biggest thing, steroids. David Ortiz, he tested positive early in his career. Now, he denied it. A lot of reports are saying that it was almost like a COVID test where it was false positive, or the fact that it was supposed to be voluntary. So David Ortiz voluntarily took this test, so he knew going into it, I have nothing to fear. I'm just doing a solid for Major League Baseball, because they were trying to get regular testing, and if enough players were testing positive, they would have the right to go ahead and test everyone in Major League Baseball. So Big Papi said, test me, and it came back positive along with Alex Rodriguez. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, they never once tested positive. So that is the argument right now. David Ortiz, how is he in the Hall of Fame even though he tested positive? But Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, they mean more to the history of baseball in comparison to David Ortiz, yet they never tested positive. Now, they did take steroids. That is without a doubt. You can just look at the head size of Barry Bonds. They were mentioned in the Balco report, and Roger Clemens, he was subjected to perjury. He almost went to prison. Barry Bonds was in the limelight as well for just lying and not really being forefront with his steroid usage. So Roger Clemens did respond. We don't have anything from Barry at the moment. And a lot of people were irked by his "he did it the right way" comment. I'm going to go ahead and scroll through his quote right here. But come on, man. Roger Clemens, you did it the right way. You were almost put in prison for perjury, which means you lied to Congress. So I think we can all admit that Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, and potentially David Ortiz use steroids, because again, a lot of people are saying David Ortiz was tested regularly after he was traded, or after he was picked up by the Red Sox. He was DFA'd by the Minnesota Twins, so it doesn't really count. I don't know. I did a poll because I really wanted to see what is the consensus of MLB Twitter, and with almost 5,000 votes, pretty much 90% of voters think that Barry Bonds is a Hall of Famer. And I would have to say, if David Ortiz with a positive test is going to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, you have to put in Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens as well. And that's why the title of today's video is very cut and dry. The Baseball Hall of Fame does not make any sense. Now, of course, Big Papi, he was bigger than life. Every single fan in Major League Baseball, whether you were an Angels fan, a Marlins fan, a Yankees fan, you had respect and you had admiration for Big Papi, David Ortiz, and I feel like he should be in the Hall of Fame. That's my opinion. And under that same perception, I feel like you have to put in Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds, considering Bud Selig is already in the Hall of Fame. Bud Selig, if you guys are younger, he was the commissioner. He was Robert Manfred during the time of Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. And just like Robert Manfred turning an eye to sticky substances, it was against the rules, but he did not enforce the rules, talking about Robert Manfred and the sticky stuff. Then all of a sudden, out of a whim, he decides to enforce the rules, and the same happened with Bud Selig. He allowed Mark McGwire, Jose Canseco, Barry Bonds, all the other steroid guys to save the game of baseball, to make himself look good, make the game of baseball billions and billions of dollars, and then he just shifted the narrative. He made them the villains. He made the writers turn against them, even though those same writers gave them all-star votes and MVP votes and Cy Young votes, and all of a sudden, they're not good enough to make the Hall of Fame. I mean, the biggest example right now of how the writers could change going forward is Alex Rodriguez. The next 10 years of voting for A-Rod is going to be a lot different than the previous 10 years for Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, because people are starting to see how two-faced Major League Baseball was to Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens. There was no enforcement. There was no rules. So they just turned a blind eye. They allowed them to save the game of baseball and profit off of their greatness, and then they just shut the door on them. A-Rod, with these hopefully new and improved perspectives of steroid usage or just pure analytics, using OPS plus or WRC plus, DRS to factor in how good players were during their peak. I mean, the fact that Dick Allen isn't even in the Hall of Fame just shows that we don't really know what we're doing as voters anymore. But let's go ahead and end the video on a positive note. And also, before we get into the positive stuff, let me know in the comments, speaking of positive, let me know, do you think Barry Bonds is a Hall of Famer? Do you think that Roger Clemens was snubbed? I think we can all agree that David Ortiz deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. But on a brighter side, Scott Rowland, Todd Helton, and Billy Wagner, they all made strides. And just a side note, a lot of people say that Todd Helton, his career was made by Coors Field. Let me show this graphic. His road OPS is higher than some notable Hall of Famers. Joe Nathan is a name that fell off the ballot, which is really unfortunate because during his peak, he was one of the best relief pitchers in the history of Major League Baseball. So again, that does it for today's video. David Ortiz has a positive test, but because it was voluntary and it wasn't supposed to be leaked, I guess it just doesn't count, and it wasn't really confirmed in terms of what substance that he used. Roger Clemens, he had a few injectables, and then, or actually I think Roger Clemens had rubbing stuff, maybe? One of them was using rubbing stuff and the other one was injecting, and they both lied about it. So let me know what you think. I don't believe you can tell the history of baseball without all three of these dudes. So in my opinion, Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, and David Ortiz, they deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. Or maybe deserve is the wrong word. They belong in the Hall of Fame because, again, you can't go through the timeline of baseball without bringing up these guys. And the same goes for A-Rod, but A-Rod was popped twice after they enforced steroids. And okay, we have a lot to deal with. Thank you guys for watching. Stick around. There's an actual MLB recap coming out tomorrow. The lockout is still in place. They rejected the third proposal, but there's some new rules and new things to talk about. So turn on those bells, stay safe out there, and I'll catch you guys tomorrow.